Today we're going to finish up Chapter 10. We're going to look at 10.3, which is some social revolutions, and we're also going to look at 10.4, which is the Nixon presidency. And to start with the social revolution, this is really looking at about 3 other civil rights movements for 3 different groups of people. Probably would have made more sense to have either put it after the civil rights movement or just to add it as a part of the civil rights movement. But regardless, here it is. And the first one we're going to look at is the rights of migrant workers. Typically, migrant workers tend to be Hispanic Americans or Hispanic immigrants. And this movement is going to be led by Cesar Chavez. And he's going to lead the United Farm Workers. And they're going to support the rights of those migrant farm workers, like I said, many of which were poor Hispanic immigrants. And he's going to work to improve the conditions under which migrant workers worked. There's not really much I can say about it. I'm just going to kind of give you the down and dirty with these, not really going to get into too much detail, as that's probably not going to be needed when we look at the tests and everything. I will say this about Chavez. He is going to take from that Southern movement, the Southern Civil Rights Movement, the nonviolent protests used by Martin Luther King Jr. And like I said, a lot of these movements are going to borrow from different parts, either the Southern or the Northern part of the Civil Rights Movement. So just keep that in mind. But he's going to borrow more from the Southern aspect, the Southern movement, and use nonviolent protests. Probably the most famous campaign of the United Farm Workers was their boycott of California table grapes, which did lead to a labor agreement in 1970. And here is Chavez. And again, focusing on nonviolence. Native Americans, now listen, we can go all the way back to Chapter 3, where we're talking about how Native Americans have been treated by the U.S. government. We can talk about the Indian Removal Act. We can talk about the taking of their land for gold or for land or for the railroad. We can talk about the Indian Wars, the Dawes Act, where we try to correct past mistakes but actually end up making them worse. But the point you get here, and as we've moved them onto reservations, but the point that you get as you look at it is that Native Americans have not fared so well in the United States. And so kind of spurred on by the civil rights movement, the early part of the civil rights movement, they're going to begin their own civil rights movement. And they're going to, again, borrow from that Southern movement, and they're going to use some of the same type of nonviolent protests that we had seen in that early Southern movement. But like we had seen with the African American movement, it is over time going to become more militant. And as a lot of movements do, when they start out nonviolent, that's good. That's good. You get a lot of success with that, a lot of support. But as things don't always go well and you have younger, let's just call them younger hotheads taking over, they do become more militant. Probably the most famous example of that militancy is the American Indian movement, AIM, actually is going to take over the island of Alcatraz and set up camp there. So again, they're going to begin to lose a lot of support as they become more militant. The women's rights movement is also going to be included in this. And a few things about this. Probably one of the bigger names involved in this is Betty Friedan. And we talked about her earlier. She had written The Feminine Mystique and kind of captured a lot of that discontent that women were feeling and kind of moved women across the country to begin demanding more in the way of equality with men. And some of that includes, I'm sorry, I went the wrong way, the Equal Rights Amendment. Okay, now the purpose here is to make sexual discrimination illegal Okay, and it's exactly what it says, equal rights. Now, most of us who look at this are going to say, oh, well, what's wrong with that? That's something totally that we agree with, that men and women should have equal rights. And on that basis alone, there's no real controversy. But as you begin to kind of go further into it, there were a lot of people, women, who had a problem with it. Of course, Betty Friedan is going to support the ERA, but probably the most notable name of that did not support it is Phyllis Schlafly. Okay, she's going to be a part of this conservative counter movement that kind of moves. Well, I'll talk about that in a second. But she saw this as anti-family. And really anti-women, anti-woman. There's some good parts. So, oh, well, men and women would make the same wage, and that's a good thing. And the problem comes in there is men are required to register for the draft, and if ERA passes, so will women. That is considered by many people to be not a good thing for women or the family per se. Really more looking at the family. And the idea, now we have women in combat today, but that's really still a very recent, a really recent development. This would have put back in the 70s women in combat roles, so decades earlier than really what it ended up being. But it's a controversial amendment, and it does pass Congress, but you have to have enough states to actually get it as added as an amendment to the Constitution. So even though it passed Congress, it failed to pass to get enough states to support it. So we do not have the Equal Rights Amendment. Okay, it was never added to the Constitution, but you do need to know what it is. People will occasionally talk about the ERA today. Just understand that it's not an actual amendment, but really supporting it or opposing it is going to fall on one of two sides of the political spectrum, and that's what I'm going to look at in just a second. Another controversial well, I'm going to call this was a Supreme Court case, a controversial Supreme Court case was Roe v. Wade in 1973. Now, this one, in this, the Supreme Court cites an implied right to privacy to rule that state laws restricting a woman's right to an abortion during the first 3 months of pregnancy was unconstitutional. So really what this does is that it opens up abortion across the United States. Okay, states cannot take away the right of abortion, at least in the first 3 months throughout the United States. Is this a big deal today? Most definitely, and we've seen this just within the last couple of months. Virginia, New York, maybe Vermont have signed laws basically stating that a baby can be aborted up to the moment of birth. And you have more conservative states trying to pass born alive bills. If a baby is meant to be aborted but is born alive, you protect it. And there's also in Georgia the heartbeat bill that you can't have an abortion once a heartbeat of a baby is detected. And so again, this was a choice. This was not a choice. Excuse me. This was a Supreme Court decision in 1973, but it is very much a part of our political dialogue today. You can look at Supreme Court justices, Kavanaugh as he was coming up. Roe v. Wade plays a key part of that. Some elections more than others, you see the abortion debate come up. And a lot of people beyond, and I say this, now I don't want to get into abortion right or wrong, agree, disagree. I want to talk about why, some people disagree and why some people want it. And one of the big reasons, and I'm not getting into the religious aspects of this, of course. Christians tend to oppose it, and your more secularists tend to support it. But again, moving beyond that, why is it so controversial today? And part of the reason is that the Supreme Court took the choice away from states to regulate the abortion industry. So a lot of times this is part of what's coming on. And people will say, we just want to put it back in the states. We just want to put the choice back at the state level and let each state determine what is allowed and what is not. But looking at between these two, the ERA and Roe v. Wade, you're going to end up on one of two sides. It's hard to take a middle. You've got the left. Left would be more of the liberal / democratic side, as stated by Betty Friedan. And on the right, the more conservative, and at least in terms of today, Republican side would be Phyllis Schlafly. Now, she is going to, because of the ERA, because of our Roe v. Wade, she is going to be a part of, and really one of the leaders of this conservative counter movement. There is, with the Great Society, a good bit of, and during this time period, this time of transition and social upheaval and social change and violence, there's a backlash against that. And people, when you go through that kind of quick change, tend to want to slow it down. And we've talked about that before, that we don't like quick change. We don't like that, and so we kind of try to slow that movement down. And that's what you see people involved in that counter movement, that conservative movement, are going to do. And again, you look at it, it goes in waves. In the 60s, we're in very much a left-leaning progressive movement in the 60s, and part of the 70s, we begin to see that shift into, and that's where the 70s are. The 70s are kind of the beginning is more of that liberal, and the end of the 70s, you begin to see the shift to a more conservative. 80s tend to be very conservative. And as we moved into the 90s, we kind of moved back into a left liberal type. And like I said, it just comes and goes. It ebbs and flows. Okay. But Schlafly actually stated that radical feminists, and she puts Betty Friedan in that role, hate men, marriage, and children, and were oppressed only in their distorted minds. So very much opposed to the more modern women's rights movement. That said, a quote for Betty Friedan is that women need a man like a fish needs a bicycle. So you can kind of hear some of where Phyllis Schlafly is getting that idea that they hate men, marriage, or at least men in marriage. Okay. Now, women who had participated in the civil rights movement, the civil rights movement is kind of what spurs them on to kind of begin their own civil rights movement, the women's rights movement. And they're going to form organizations like now the National Organization for Women, which, by the way, still exists, and they're going to use that to promote their own rights. So probably of the three that we've talked about just now, the women's rights is the biggest of those three. So what I want you to do in terms of questions, the two questions for chapter 10.3. Number one, in what ways did the civil rights movement for African Americans influence other civil rights movements? What are some specific ways the civil rights movement from 10.1 influenced these three civil rights movements from 10.3? Okay. Question number 2. For each of the three movements, tell who you think influenced them the most. I don't want who led them. I do not want the leader. Who influenced them? Give me a name. And if there was a shift involved, give me both names. Give me 2 names. But let me know what persons influenced them probably the most. As with every section, if you have any questions, please, by all means, write that in the question section, okay? All right, finally, to end Chapter 10, we're going to look at the Nixon presidency. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. One of the first things we need to talk about is just foreign policy and beyond Vietnam, of course. And the most important thing here is détente with China, or just détente in general. He wants to ease tensions between us and communist nations. And instead of using force and intimidation to do that, he wants to use diplomacy. Okay, think back to what the term détente means. Okay, he is going to be the first to acknowledge publicly that communist China exists. Everybody knew it existed, but he's going to be the first. When we say that, acknowledging them publicly, he's going to speak with them and look at treaties. He's going to visit them during his first term. He's also going to meet with the leader of the Soviet Union and negotiate a treaty lessening the number of nuclear missiles. So what you're looking at here is kind of a drawback. And I don't want to say that this is going to end the Cold War. I think maybe there was probably hope. But you can see kind of a warming up of tensions, okay? What I want you to do for your number one question for 10-4 is I want you to look at this cartoon, okay? I want you to look at this cartoon and tell me how this is an appropriate way, why this is an appropriate way to illustrate détente. So take a few minutes and tell me why this is a good illustration for détente. Nixon's domestic policy was called New Federalism. It's not often that you have a named policy with Republicans, but here's one. And it's kind of continues to carry on with Johnson's programs, but moving back from it. And this is a part of that shift, that conservative shift, okay? He does want to cut government programs and spending and give more power back to the states. And a lot of that is getting into conservative/Republican criticism of the cost of the Great Society. So we're going to cut those programs and spending, and we're going to give that back to the states, okay? Again, you can look at states' rights in this also. He also wanted to turn back the aggressive tide of the civil rights legislation and was not talking about doing away with civil rights. He wasn't talking about undoing civil rights legislation, but he's looking at more of a middle road between instant integration and segregation forever. So he's kind of looking at, I guess we could call this gradualism, kind of a gradual way to get to where we want to go, okay? The instant integration is good in some ways, but at the same time, it's that sudden change that people don't like. And he felt like, and a lot of Republicans felt like this led to a lot of race riots during the 60s. His commitment was to limit the efforts to build the Great Society and to limit the enforcement of civil rights laws. Again, not to undo, but just to limit. His Southern strategy is going to be designed to gain support from Southern conservatives, and his whole point here is to turn the formerly Democratic Solid South that we had seen as a very reliable Democratic voting bloc since pre-Civil War days into a Republican stronghold. And he really does succeed with that in 1968. And he's going to use the whole idea of law and order. He's going to use the violence associated with Democratic policies against the Democrats as he runs for president. So it's very successful in turning the South into a Republican stronghold for the first time ever. Okay. Also going on at this time was the oil embargo. A lot of this has to do with our relations with the Middle East, particularly with Israel. We supported Israel. We always support Israel. Since Israel was founded in 1948, we have supported Israel pretty much across the board. There's a couple of instances in more recent times where we've not, but for the most part, America is a staunch supporter of Israel. So we're going to support Israel during its war with Egypt and Syria. And the OPEC nations are going to impose an embargo on us. And remember what we talked about in World War II, an embargo is a refusal to sell something, and in this case, oil. So they're going to refuse to sell oil to us. And this is going to lead to a fuel crisis in 1973. Now, in some ways, I don't know if this makes sense to a lot of people because we're so oil rich ourselves. But we were buying a lot of overseas oil, a lot of foreign oil. So this is actually going to lead to a recession too. And Americans are going to begin to sit in long lines. We're going to begin to pay high prices for gas if it was available. Now, the embargo doesn't last a long time, a few months, but the economic hardship is going to be real, and it shows us how dependent we are on foreign oil. And we had big cars. You can kind of look. We had big cars back up until about the 1970s. Look at this. You can tell there's a system for who gets gas on what day. And that's going to change. We're going to begin to move into the 70s, getting into the latter 70s and into the 80s with smaller cars. And the big cars aren't going to begin to come back to the late 80s, early 90s when we start to see the SUVs. You see the lines here waiting for gas. The embargo is going to show us that we don't have a limitless supply, of natural resources, and that we've got to do what we can to conserve. And so this is going to lead and contribute to the rise of the environmental movement. It advocates conservation and government policies designed to preserve and protect the environment. Congress is going to pass some legislation to maintain clean air and water, and that's the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. They also are going to establish the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, which is still with us today. And the Democratic Congress passed and Nixon signed the EPA. So this is bipartisan. This is Republican and Democratic support of this. Not all Republicans in Congress are going to support this because they feel like this is going to limit the opportunity for businesses to create jobs. And again, that's where you get into the differences between the left and the right, Republicans and Democrats. Democrats tend to support regulation, whether it's business regulation or even land usage regulation. And Republicans tend to be against that, and with the argument that it limits job opportunities. Okay, so your second question here is, in what way were the oil embargo and the environmental protection related? How do these two go together? How did that embargo lead to environmental protection? Okay. The final thing we need to look at is Watergate and the end of the Nixon presidency. Watergate is still important. It is still talked about, and we hear this today. There's shades of Watergate when we talk about all this going on around with Trump. And a lot of the things that you hear in the news today, oh, this is bigger than Watergate. And both sides claim that. The Democrats claim that Trump and his abuses is bigger than Watergate. And Republicans claim that the Democrats' efforts to unseat Trump is a scandal bigger than Watergate. So both sides are referring back to Watergate. And Watergate is, oddly enough, Nixon wasn't involved in it, but he does involve himself in the cover-up, and it's all surrounding the election of 1972, which he wins easily. But his advisors, when he's running, were nervous because of the war protests and the social unrest in America at that time, and they were looking for some political conspiracies. So they're going to have to ferret those out. How do we know? And so one of their plans was to wiretap the phones at the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate office complex. This is a big old hotel. The Watergate's a hotel. Now, the thing here is that you have in this case, it's not the president. It is not the administration. It is his advisors, and they are bugging the offices of a rival political campaign. And this is bad. This is really bad. And again, Nixon didn't know, but when things start happening, the guys who did the wiretapping were arrested for breaking and entering. It was crazy. Um, and you've got a leak at the FBI calling in the Washington Times reporters, Bernstein and, well, I can't remember his name right offhand, would I'll get it to in a minute. But they're calling them and setting this up, and so they begin to investigate this, and it comes out that Nixon knew about it afterwards and helped cover it up. So the scandal is going to lead Nixon to becoming the only president to resign from office. What if he had stayed in office? Well, he would have been impeached by the House, and he probably would have been found guilty by the Senate and expelled from office. This is Watergate's huge. It does further erodes. The Pentagon Papers did a huge job with this too, but it further erodes citizens' trust in the government. Woodward was his name, Bernstein and Woodward. And you've got the cartoons, and you can see kind of how dejected people look over that. And Nixon hangs on as long as he can before he finally resigns. Oddly enough, his vice president at this point was not elected as his vice president. His vice president, Spiro Agnew, had already resigned for tax problems, breaking tax laws. And so once Nixon resigns, Gerald Ford becomes the only president we've ever had who was not elected. And so just a little piece of trivia there. The economy during Nixon's administration was not great. Spending on Vietnam had caused inflation. We had seen economic growth stagnate. A lot of that would have to do with that embargo. And so Nixon's going to respond by imposing wage and price controls. This is bad. This is bad. We can impose these all day long, but as soon as you let them go, everything goes haywire again, and they don't work. They don't work. But they're particularly unpopular with the Republican Party, and he is a Republican, so this does not help him among his own party. Okay. All right. So you've got your 2 questions for this. So you've got 4 altogether for this lecture. And again, if you have any questions, write that down, and I'll try to answer those and get those back to you.